The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, health, and business. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they've been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I am your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr. Joining us on today's program is Ms. Deborah Fraser-Howze, the President and CEO of the Black Leadership Commission on AIDS, the principal organization in the African American community dealing with this plague, this disease called AIDS. Deborah, glad to talk with you about this disease because, as you know, I serve on the Black Leadership Commission on AIDS.
Vice Chair.
Along with many distinguished New Yorkers.
Yeah.
What really is the magnitude of this problem of AIDS in our community, in the African American community?
AIDS in the African American community is out of control completely. When you look at what happened, the epidemic is now 13 years old, and there's an argument whether it's 13 or 15 years old exactly. When you look at the first 9 years of the epidemic, you'll look at more than 1/3 of the cases coming to fruition. When you look at the last 12 months of the epidemic, you see another third of the cases coming to fruition, the final third of the cases, and the majority of them are Black and Latino.
You're talking about the movement from being HIV positive to full-blown AIDS.
To having full-blown AIDS. There are millions of people that are walking around that are HIV positive. The majority of them do not know it, do not know that they're infected. You are diagnosed with AIDS when you have one or more of a series of opportunistic infections, which will range from anywhere from a skin cancer called sarcoma to a pneumonia called PCP. And then the doctor can pick that up and say, okay, this person either needs to be tested or there's this certain set of circumstances that will classify you as someone with full-blown AIDS. Now, in New York City, there are over 70,000 people now with full-blown AIDS. And when you hear people talk about the term, use the term AIDS, they're talking about people who have progressed from HIV positive into the epidemic. We're not talking about the millions of people outside of that that are HIV positive and either do not know it or have not progressed to full-blown AIDS.
Now, when we look at it just in terms of raw numbers, you say there's 70,000 people diagnosed with full-blown AIDS. What percent of those are African American?
Well, right now in New York City, 39%, and this is a figure that you can take all around the country. 39% of them are Black, and 30% of them are Latino, and 1% of them are other. That's a very nebulous sort of category. They put Asian Americans under that category. Native Americans are under that category. It's sort of it's a wrong category. We're trying to change that and make those numbers more specific.
Well, I did hear that there's an increasing number of HIV positives in the Asian community, which will then, as you say, another 5 years or 10 years later will be a larger number of Asian Americans.
Right.
Now, what about the white Americans? As most of the audience knows, originally AIDS was considered to be a gay white man's disease.
Right. Originally in 1979, and they actually didn't name it until 1980 and named it AIDS.
Which is,
AIDS,
what does the AIDS stand for?
Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome.
Which is the reason why people with AIDS come out with opportunistic
Exactly, because their immune system becomes deficient. And they get a syndrome, a sort of selection of different opportunistic infections, different diseases, and their bodies cannot fight off this infection. If you got a cold tomorrow, you would be able to fight off that cold because your T cells would come out and attack that cold. If a person with AIDS gets a cold, that person is in a world of trouble because they don't have the number of T cells that can go out and fight a cold like you and I, as somebody that has a normal immune system, would have.
Well, people don't die from AIDS. They die from some of these opportunistic
Yeah, that's very important for
right?
people to know that people don't die from AIDS. They do die from the opportunistic infections. And I usually do a little example when I'm talking to young people, but a doctor, one of the doctors on the commission, in fact, Dr. Barbara Justice, Dr. Beverly Prince, had a session and they were talking to some people up in Harlem, And for the first time, I completely understood how this disease works. And they talked about the T cells being cops, like patrolmen in the body. And they go out, and that's their job, and they can't help it. It's sort of God made this way. And they go out and they fight off everything that they see is wrong in the system. If your cells are supposed to be oval and a cell would pass with 2 bumps in it, they would recognize those 2 bumps and know that that's some kind of a virus. So they're programmed to attack this bump in this cell structure. When they attack it, though, when you have AIDS, when the T cell attacks, the T cell then acquires a piece of the virus, and it goes back into the quadri where the other T cells are, and it continues to infect. The virus is so intelligent that after a while, and the T cells are also very intelligent, after a while they'll say, no, I'm not going to attack these bumps anymore. I'm going to just let the bumps go by. And the AIDS will realize that they're not being attacked, and they'll turn themselves into a square. So they'll keep having the T cells come out and kill themselves and turn into squares and turn into bumps until finally they dissipate and they're gone. And then you have no immune system. And that's where you hear somebody with a T cell count of 2.
What is considered to be the average T cell count, and when you fall below a certain point, when are you considered to be in danger?
People range in T cell counts from 1,200 to about 2,000, which is around normal. Right now, the clinical protocol is to give somebody AZT, which is the proven drug of record for the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration. They'll give you AZT when your T cells are now 500 and below. It used to be 200. There is so much going on in science and the clinical trials around this that kind of information changes every day. But Blacker was involved in the first state-of-the-art for the NIH, the National Institute of Health, when we looked at changing the number of T cells before one would start to get any kinds of protocols of medication and raise that number up to 500 as a danger level.
Now, you have been the President and CEO, Executive Director of the Black Leadership Commission on AIDS, which you call Blacker. How did you get into this? What stimulated your interest in this, which then caused many of us to become involved?
Well, some of the people, the majority of the people that we called sort of together to have that first meeting in Glen Cove were all people that I knew. They were all black leaders, you among them, all black leaders who in some way had some effect on my life and the lives of my peers in a very positive way. And based on the whole notion that our community is not a bankrupt community. Our community is very rich with talent and resources, and most importantly, people in the leadership who want to help other people in the community. While I was at the Urban League, I was the director of teenage services at the Urban League. We used to do a number of series where we would bring in the leadership to talk about specific issues around children and sex and those kinds of issues, bring in all of the clergy. Dr. Dumpson used to come in all the time, and him and Reverend Calvin Butts would have debates. You know, we'll take the children if the children, we need to be having that debate now, listening to what's going on in Congress. Who's going to take the children? We keep talking about these girls who are pregnant, and nobody's really talking about what's going to happen with the children that are here now, other than to put them in orphanages, which is another program. But in my history, I was a teenage mother. I had 2 children by the age of 17. My oldest daughter, Tanya, is a graduate of Vassar and an actress. In fact, she was on a show just the other night, Living Single. She did a wonderful job, I think so, because I'm her mother.
Proud mother.
Yes, and Tanya is now 26 years old, and my youngest daughter, Sheena, is a new graduate of Columbia University Law School. She's passed the bar. She's an associate attorney at Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen & Katz, a major corporate law firm on Park Avenue in Manhattan. And I have a 4-year-old grandson. I have a 7-year-old son and a 16-year-old son.
Well, you are very expert in this parenting
Yeah,
field.
I was for a long time.
And of course, because of your own experience, you're very much concerned about the relationship of sex and AIDS and the need for safe sex.
Absolutely, it was so obvious to me when you looked at. At the Urban League, we had, when I got there, we developed a $5 million portfolio for services for teenage pregnancy and children at risk of all kinds of problems. And when I looked around, we developed these centers around the city. One of them was in Harlem, Family Redirection, up in Harlem, across the street from Convent Avenue Baptist Church, a little brownstone that we rented. and the girls would go in there, and we must have served about, at any unit of service, as the city would call it, we served about 115 girls at each time and maybe 60 young men at each time. And it was so obvious to me, these girls were having sex. They weren't using protection. If it was about using a latex condom to prevent the transmission of infection, we were in trouble, because that wasn't what was going on. It just so happens that one young man came into the center once. He was 17 years old. He had a 2-year-old daughter, and he had another young woman pregnant. And he was talking about this virus that he had as if he had a common cold. And the executive director that was on site, I was director citywide, called me up, and she was frantic. And we talked about this, and I tried to find some services for this young man who was not gay and not an intravenous drug user. And whatever services were available, he wouldn't go. You know, he had great resistance to it. And I started to ask myself, what's going on here? Is this looks like the tip of the iceberg? And we put out a clarion call to the leadership, the clergy, the politicians, the social policy experts, the business leaders, everybody, and said, we've got to come together and form some kind of a council of elders. And we've got to really look at this problem, because this problem is killing our children. And that was back in 1986. We were incorporated, and we opened up in 1987. We were incorporated in 1988.
Now, talk about the numbers. Let's take the borough of Queens, which is a predominantly middle-class borough in New York City. How does the racial and age and gender breakdown occur in that borough?
Well, what's interesting about Queens, and it's a good borough to look at, because people, we just got a recent report saying that blacks in Queens are doing economically well, and in some cases better economically than the white community out in Queens. So Queens is a very good place to start. We know that a lot of our brothers and sisters out in Queens have educations, they're employed, that kind of thing. And you would expect that their health status would be relatively higher than in some high need index communities where the economic and the educational is much more of a great disparity. When you look at blacks in Queens, they constitute some 20% of all people in Queens, white at 48.5 and Latinos at 19.4. But the major problem is that when you look at the AIDS cases, black people constitute 41.4% of people with AIDS in Queens, and Latinos 26.9% of people with AIDS in Queens, although, and in great contrast to the fact that they're 20% of the population in Queens and 19% respectively.
Now, what about the age? Because that's very interesting, because given the HIV infection and then the development to AIDS, there's a certain time interval between the time that a person is HIV positive and they contract full-blown AIDS. As I've just read recently that some people go as long as 15 years.
Well, medical circles have just now come to the conclusion that we do need to go up to 15 years. We need to look at the latency period of this epidemic before it starts to show itself through one of those opportunistic infections, and it can be as long as 15 years. 48.2% of AIDS cases in the borough of Queens are between the ages of 30 and 39. If you look at the 15-year split within that, you can say that maybe an average age was, if you go to the high end of 39, was about 24. But if you look at 30, then you can go back and say that the other high end on the young side is at 15. So we figure that the majority of people got infected anywhere between the ages of 18 and 20 in Queens, and now have gone on to full-blown AIDS at 48.2%.
Now, in the beginning stages of the epidemic, most of the cases that were identified were gay white males.
Right.
This has changed now.
Absolutely.
And that's due, I understand, because of the large number of intravenous drug users and heterosexual activity with partners who are HIV positive that the other people don't know about.
Well, there is a major shift in the AIDS epidemic. We used to say about 5 years ago it was politically incorrect to say that the epidemic had shifted, because you didn't want to leave out those individuals in the first wave of the epidemic. But if you don't look at this as a shift now, we'll never look at this as a shift. We used to say the epidemic has expanded. It has done both, and the shift has been very, very dramatic. Right now, if you just stick with the borough of Queens, and if you look at pediatric cases are very, very important, because it tells you something about the women who are infected in that borough. 60.7% of all pediatric cases in the borough of Queens are black.
Those are children below the age
Those are children that are under the age of 13. And for the Latino population, it's 22.2%. So
most of the children are people from children of minority parents.
82%.
Which raises another question about the children who are orphaned by parents who have AIDS. Now that is a very, very serious problem. It's just beginning to show itself.
A major residual of this epidemic, and we have not even begun to imagine what all of them could possibly be, is the estimated 125,000 children that will be orphaned as a result of losing one or both parents.
This is nationally.
Nationally. It is estimated that there'll be about 30,000 here in New York City. However, in a recent data report released from the Center for Disease Control last year, they looked at AIDS with a new definition. They added 2 new opportunistic infections to the list of things that can make you have AIDS. One of them, and for the first time, was associated with women only, and it was cervical cancer. When you look at what happened within that 12-month span of time, the increase of heterosexual transmission, because now they began to look at women and began to pick this up, rised across the nation 111%. In New York City, where AIDS is the #1 cause of death for black women in childbearing age, the increase in heterosexual transmission for black women was up 185%. And it took the Black Leadership Commission on AIDS a lot of work, but we were able to extrapolate that out of the CDC information and have the City of New York, Department of Health, and the state confirm it for us.
Yeah, one of the things the Black Leadership Commission on AIDS has done is to begin to focus the health agencies and the providing agencies on the nature of the problem in the African American community, right, which then leads to education. Right. For example, heterosexual transmission is probably due to previous intravenous drug use.
Well, yes, it absolutely is. And when you look at this epidemic borough by borough, city by city, and you look at it within health districts, you will see a large numbers increase because of intravenous drug use. But you're now beginning to see something else. You're beginning to see a sort of a trickle effect that goes not up and down in the community, but across the community. And you're now beginning to see a number of men and women who are presenting with opportunistic infections with no other risk behavior except their heterosexual activity, and no connection in any way to someone that they know is an active or former intravenous drug user. And what that says, there was once a slogan, we need to revive it. Is anybody, the person that you sleep with, you have to remember that you've slept with everybody they've ever slept with before. I think that was the most chilling message for me, and understanding that that is the case, and we are now really beginning to see the residual of that. We have a major concern about the young people that are going to be orphaned as a result of this epidemic.
Now, the pattern that you described in Queens with regard to African Americans and AIDS and Latinos, I imagine that pattern is replicated in the Bronx and Brooklyn and Manhattan, and maybe even to a greater extent.
Sure. We gave you Queens because, again, that was the borough that for us can show a great number of individuals that are in a high economic strata with high attainments of levels of education. When you look at the areas that BLACA focuses on, the other areas like Harlem, Southeast Queens, for example, Harlem, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brownsville, Community Board 1 on Staten Island, and you see a much more drastic picture.
What percent of the total cases in New York City are African American? You said 40, I believe, earlier.
Right, 39%.
39%.
Together with the Latino population, blacks and Latinos in this city now constitute over 70% of people infected with AIDS.
Now, in terms of what
And that's across the whole state, not just the city of New York.
Now, in terms of what the Black Leadership Commission on AIDS is going to do, I know that you have the project with the ministers and the dissemination through New York State, through some of the major cities, and then nationally. Now, what is your objective? Is your objective education? Is it patient services? Is it treatment? Or all of the above?
Okay, we have a three-pronged mission that you know because you helped write it. So we've been in existence for 8 years, and we have a three-pronged mission. And the first piece is to organize and educate indigenous black leadership. We were really visionary in the work that we were doing. Everybody else was organizing and educating what has now become, quote unquote, the AIDS community. But what we're finding is that everybody is now looking in the Centers for Disease Control, the President's Commission on AIDS, Bush's last commission before it was defunct. Everyone has come out with these protocols saying that we have to broaden the level of leadership and the type of leadership that's now involved in this epidemic, because the epidemic is massive, it is everywhere, it is international. We have to bring in our legislative leaders. We have to bring in people who can push buttons and make things happen. People who have some history and some contextual history and are culturally competent in our community. The people who have gone through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and 80s. You know, when I remember when we first called everybody into Glen Cove, and I called one of the legislators' office, and they said, well, you know, let me send you our health person. And I said, no. This man has been elected into office for 16 years. We don't want his health person. We want him to come here and tell us how he got elected for 16 years. And we want to take that vehicle and use that vehicle to send a message through about AIDS, because that vehicle clearly does work. So organizing indigenous black leadership is one part of the mission. The other part of the mission is building the capacity of service providers. Providers of service in our communities are in trouble. They are not getting an adequate share of funding. So resource realignment is one of the major things that BLACA looks at. And we don't do it with frivolity. We don't just say, well, the black people need money. We are looking at the statistics. We can give you database research, understanding where the epidemic is a public health epidemic. To not put resources where the epidemic has moved is unthinkable in public health. And we just want to hold people to that whole notion, that Hippocratic oath of first do no harm. We ask for no more than what anybody else in public health needs to be looking at if you're a policy person in public health. And we're just asking them to stay within the context of what we know and what we've been told by the public health industry is the right thing to do. So building the capacity of service providers is very important to deal with the numbers that we're seeing. The last and one of the most important parts of our mission is to give communities of African descent a visible presence wherever public policy is formulated and resources are allocated. And Roscoe, one of the things that we're suffering from now is a large boom in public policy around AIDS in the first wave of the epidemic, say 1980 to 1983, 84, that was focused on a different population. We now have a situation where we have multiple generations of the same race dying simultaneously across two continents. We have a very different situation. AIDS looks very different in the black community. And where you would have a homemaker be assigned to an individual with AIDS, and they would come into the apartment, they would take care of that person and give that person competent care, you would now have a policy, maybe in the city of New York, where they would still assign a homemaker to the individual infected. But this individual now has a different face. This individual has 5 children. This individual is a single black female who's a mother of these 5 children. And while you're assigned to take care of this individual, these 5 children are standing there watching their mother die. There's no competent care being associated with it. And you may, in fact, as a homemaker, not be allowed, because of these units of service and these other kinds of things that the city uses to judge their own performance, be allowed to serve these children food. Now, that means that the policies have to be drastically changed. And what's happening, unfortunately, is that this disease is moving so fast and furiously that it takes a great thrust of advocacy to make those policies change at
Well,
this
what's
point.
happening with regard to the budget cuts? Because at the state level and at the city level, there are budget cuts. Now, I understand that there's some effort to try to move up the money from the state, but there's still cuts at the city level. What can be done to mute some of those cuts?
Well, we're still analyzing the budget, and I can tell you now from what we're looking at, there is a new paper that's been released by the Gay Men's Health Crisis on the Medicaid cuts. There's a new paper released by the Pataki administration on the Medicaid cuts. We don't know yet what devastation the Medicaid cuts are going to cause across the AIDS field. I know for a fact that a lot of services have been built around the uninsured. And if these individuals are now getting Medicaid and you cut the number of times they can see a doctor, if you cut essential services to people with AIDS, you know, people with AIDS can get a very fierce infection on the foot, a fungal infection that won't go away for years. They need care and treatment for cracked skin, for bleeding, for all of those things associated with these kinds of AIDS-related complexes, they will call. They're not really opportunistic infections that people with AIDS get. If you cut the number, if you say you can't go to a podiatrist anymore and Medicaid will pay for it, then you've put these people in a very special kind of risk situation. And we've got to begin to look at all of the medical issues and all of what's going to happen to Medicaid to really understand the severity of these cuts.
Of course, that's really what the Black Leadership Commission is about, and that's what your leadership is about. It's very apparent just in hearing you talk, as I have on other occasions, that you not only have the commitment, but you have a total understanding of this problem, this concern, and in one sense it is a mobilizing device to get the African American community to work together, not just on AIDS, not just on teenage pregnancy, not just on safe sex, but on the whole panoply of health and other social service issues.
Absolutely, and it is our hope. You know, everything that we do at Black, is built on a very Afrocentric model and that whole African piece. And it is my hope that people begin to go back to the future, I call it. Go back to using that Afrocentric model that brought us through all of our adversities, bringing together those kinds of councils of elders and guiding us through what we need to be guided
And that is a
through.
good point to end our discussion today. We've been talking with Deborah Fraser-Howze, the President and CEO of the Black Leadership Commission on AIDS. This has been a very interesting discussion, and thank you very much, Debbie, for being with us.
Thank you, Russ, and thank you for being a leader in our group.